Hey everyone, how you doing? It's the start of a new month, which means it's time for me to catch you up on the reading I did last month. So in terms of the numbers, I had a pretty good reading month in June. I've been having a pretty good reading year, to be honest, so I'm doing really well in that respect, and I hope it continues for the second half of the year. This wrap up will be slightly different in one respect, and that is with regards to SPFBO. So, two of the books that I read in June were for SPFBO 8, and in the spirit of the competition, until the semi finalist is announced, I'm not going to be giving scores for those books. But other than that, I'll follow the same kind of pattern, so stats first and then talking about the books. So as I said, it was a pretty good reading month in June. In terms of finished books, the page count I covered was 3006. I did actually DNF a book, which is something that I don't normally do, and I read about 250 pages over the course of May and June in that book before I DNF'd it, but we'll find out more about that in a moment. So the stats will only look at the books that I actually finished, so that's 6 in total, and it gives me an average page count of 501, and the average star rating I gave those books was 3.67. For the year-to-date figures, that puts me at 16,157 pages completed, an average page count of 514, and an average rating of 4.01. For my series stats, I've got 13 series that I've now started in 2022, 2 that I've finished, so I've moved up one there. Still haven't DNF'd any series, which means the total number of series that I'm currently up to date with is 12, and the ongoing series that I've not finished yet and not put down is 24. And then the last little bit for the stats is the days since the last 5-star read. This is currently sitting at the 1st of July at 31 because my last 5-star read was right at the end of May, which does mean, spoiler alert, there were no 5-star reads in June. There were a couple that got close, but none actually made it to the 5-star rating. Let's go and have a look at the individual books though. So first of all, I'll cover off the DNF I had, and this was actually my carryover from May. So I started reading it in May and I eventually put it down a little bit into June, and I realised I'd been reading it for quite a long time and I wasn't really making any headway with it, and that's a large part of the reason why I decided to put it down. This one was a review copy that I got through NetGalley, and it was In the Shadow of Lightning, book 1 of the Glass Immortals, I think the series is called, by Brian McClellan. Now this one I DNF'd at 40%, it's a little bit under 600 pages, so I covered about 240 pages of this book before deciding to put it down. And I was reading it and not getting very far through it. As I say, I was going very slowly, partly because it did have quite long chapters, and if I'm not really engrossed in a book, that really does slow me down reading it overall. As I was reading it though and not getting very far with it, I was thinking to myself, I wasn't enjoying it, it was just that I wasn't not enjoying it. So this was a bit of a weird one because I have said to a couple of people on Discord, and I think I put it in my written review on Goodreads as well, I'm not really sure what it was about this book. I couldn't really put my finger on why I wasn't really enjoying it. It was just kind of very mediocre, I suppose. It was just okay. There was nothing that really jumped out. I liked the concept of it. The writing was okay, it was fine, there was no problems there. The story I thought was okay. I just don't know what it was, but it just didn't pull it all together for me, and I just thought it was okay. And a comment that I saw somewhere actually was, with regards to this book, all of the reviews this person had seen ranged from meh to DNF. And I agree with that. Most of the reviews that I've seen myself, people I know who've read this book, have all agreed I DNF'd it, and 3 or 4 friends of mine who've also read it as review copies, they all pretty much said meh. So not really sure what it was. I was excited for it, but this book just didn't work. I liked the idea, as I say. The glass magic was pretty good. The prologue I actually quite liked. It was quite a long prologue, but it gave a really good idea about the world, about the character, about not necessarily what the ongoing story is going to be, but it did set that up quite nicely. There were some really good scenes in there where you've got, I think it's glass dancers they're called, these mages who can manipulate different forms of glass. And you've got this glass dancer there with all of these little tiny shards of glass rising up from the earth behind him, and he's just ready to shoot them into the enemy ahead of him, and he just lets them drop instead. And that was a really kind of powerful scene for me. I thought there was some really good potential to this, but in the 230 or so pages that I read before I DNF'd it, I just didn't see that potential coming to fruition. So it was definitely a disappointment because I didn't finish the book, but it was my first experience of Brian McClellan. I wasn't going to go for his Powder Mage series because it's not really my cup of tea, and it seems that this one was not going to be my cup of tea either. So when I put that one down, the next book that I picked up was my first series finish in a little while. The third book in the Lacania series by James Islington, The Light of All That Falls. And this was a pretty chunky book, so it took a little while for me to get through. And maybe that's why it took me a while to get to it as well, because it was a little bit off-putting when I'm trying to get through various books, and this one just takes up a bit more time than some of the others. The overall story for Lacanius I really enjoyed, but it was very strange for a series as far as I'm concerned, because normally when I'm looking at a series I tend to enjoy them a bit more as we go. This Lacanius was exactly the opposite. I really enjoyed The Shadow of What Was Lost, and then An Echo of Things to Come, book 2, was good but not quite as good, and then this one, The Light of All That Falls, for me was the worst of the three of them. So it just went downhill from the start, and that's obviously a disappointment. I just thought this one was maybe trying to be a little bit too clever. I felt that it lost its way a little bit. There is time travel in this book, and it starts to play more of an important role. So this third book does delve quite heavily into time travel and various different plot devices around that. And I think it just didn't work to me. It was a bit too much, and it was kind of difficult really to keep track of what's actually happening and what timeline we're in at what particular point and what consequences there's going to be, because I don't know exactly, is this a future person or is this a present person? And it just got a little bit too confusing. So that was the main thing for me that kind of took it down in my estimation and made it not as good as those opening books in the series. So this one I gave 3 stars to. I'm glad that I finished it, if nothing else because I don't have this one on my TBR anymore. Next up I went for an audiobook, and this one was The Coward by Stephen Aryan, and I really enjoyed this. I've heard a lot of good things about it, lots of people really rating it highly, and I'm glad to say that I agree with them. I had a really good time with this, and the narration was really good as well, which obviously helped with that. I like the idea of this one. It's not your typical hero story. I mean, it's kind of in the name there, but with this one you've got this hero of a past adventure. He's the saviour of the land, although that's not really how it actually went, and he gets called on to complete another mission to essentially save the land again, and he doesn't want to do that because he's a bit of a coward. I really like the way that that's framed in the story and the way that it kind of pulls into the story as we go forward, and how despite the fact that he's definitely not a youngster, the character still does manage to develop quite a bit as the pages turn. So overall it was a really good book, but I like also the way that it's a very different character. So as I say, he's not your typical hero. He's definitely a flawed character, but the majority of his flaws are kind of mental flaws, and it's the way that he's been affected by what he has done in the past and what he has witnessed in the past and what has happened to the people that he was friends with and he cared for. And it was just a kind of a breath of fresh air really to have that, not only to have those kind of themes in a story, but done very, very well. I really thought that the author did a very good job with that, and I'm really excited to continue with The Warrior, which is the second and final book in this series. So this one was one of my very close but not quite 5 stars. I gave The Coward 4.5 because I did really enjoy it, but I just didn't think it was quite a 5-star read for me. I also then continued my audiobook journey with Rob J. Hayes and The War Eternal. So I listened to book 2 in this series, which is The Lessons Never Learned. And again, this is one that I really enjoyed the first book. I rated it 5 stars. It was my last 5-star read as it happens. This one was just a little bit of a step down. Not too much, it was still a very good book, but it just wasn't quite as good as the first book. I think the bar was set really high in Along the Razor's Edge, and it was going to take something pretty special, to be honest, for this book to even match it, let alone surpass it. So I like that we see more of a world. I said in my review for Along the Razor's Edge that one of the things that was maybe lacking because of the way the story was told and what happens in the story, one of the things that was a bit lacking perhaps was a bit of exploration of the world. And with the way the story goes here and at the end of Along the Razor's Edge, we do get that in book 2 here. And it's quite an interesting world actually. I like some of the concepts there, even if they're maybe a little bit kind of weird trying to actually visualize them. You've got big floating cities, so rather than just airships, which you do get quite a bit in certain fantasy stories, this one had entire cities, or at least one entire city that was floating or flying, I guess, through the air. And that was pretty strange, but it did give quite a few little opportunities for exploring a bit more of the world without all of the actual travel in between, because we were doing that. We were traveling without kind of feeling like we were traveling. It wasn't characters walking through the countryside or riding horses about. They were just doing whatever they were doing, and when they woke up they'd be in a new place, for instance. So I thought that was an interesting way of covering that, and it meant that we didn't have some of those kind of boring transitions in between where we've got odd little side quests happening and odd little bits of conversation to try and break up that travel. So I thought that was done really well. Some of the other bits didn't work quite as well for me. I thought there was maybe a little bit of confusion with some of the little bits and pieces that happened, a few little conveniences, but overall it was still a really enjoyable story. Fantastic narration from Moira Quirk, and this one was, as I say, not quite as good as Along the Razor's Edge, so I gave it 4.5 stars. I then got my 2 SPFBO reads that I started in June. So these are the 2 books that I'm not going to give ratings to. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the books themselves, and the first of those was The Blood of Outcasts by D.A. Smith. I got this one whilst I was reading it actually, which was quite nice because I was reading on my Kindle and then I was able to swap over and do some physical book reading as well. The story here is a Japanese inspired setting, and you've got ronin and katanas and various other bits of terminology from a kind of feudal Japan setting, and I like the way that none of that was going over my head. There was nothing that was too confusing and kind of put me out of place because I wasn't able to follow what things were and what was happening because of the language used. So the world building here is definitely very accessible, and that's one of the high points, I think, of this particular story. It's a tale of revenge at its centre. You've got a first-person story narrated by a character who has been essentially left for dead. She was executed, not very well, and her clan and her master have all been destroyed or killed, and she's out there for revenge, therefore, on the people who brought that about. So it's a very kind of straightforward book. There's not a lot of twists and turns to it. I did enjoy the overall concept and the world and the idea, but there were some letdowns in here for me as well, and primary amongst those was the writing, which I just did not get on with whatsoever. I won't go into it in too much detail here, but if you want to hear a bit more about my thoughts on this book, check out my dedicated review in the top corner there. The second book that I read for SPFBO in June was by Mark Holloway, and it was The Souls Aspect. This is book 1 in the series called The Aspect, and this one I did admittedly have a better time with. Again, I really liked the idea here. You've got kind of a magic school, but it's not your usual magic school setting, which I quite appreciated, but you've got a character who learns that he is an aspector, so that's this world's magicians essentially, and he goes along to an academy to learn how to use and control the aspect or the magic, and he ends up put on a completely different path to the one that he thought he would be taking. Now the tagline for this book is a healer turned killer, so that pretty much tells you what those 2 pathways were. He's the son of the town's healer, and that's the original pathway that he thought he was going to go along. He's just looking to follow in his father's footsteps essentially. but with learning his magic and the individual talents that he has within that, he's put onto a different pathway. It's not the one that he wants, but it's the one that the masters at the academy, his tutors, want him to take and force him into, essentially. So I like the way that that kind of brings the story to a very interesting kind of focus point, and there's a few different pathways that we can converge on from there. So it's very interesting to see which one the character kind of chooses or is forced down, whichever way you want to look at it. And I really enjoyed everything that led up to that one. There's some really interesting aspects to this book, excuse the pun, and I'm really looking forward actually to seeing how some of those tie together and what is still incorporated in the story when we get to book 2. And then the 6th book that I read in June was a buddy read that my patrons picked, and a bunch of us read Burn Red Skies by Kirsten Espinosa Rosero. This is one of the finalists from SPFBO 7 that finished up a month or two ago, and this was one of the ones that I was really excited to read because, I mean, I love this particular book. I love the cover, and it's a really good quality book in this hardback copy as well, so that's a definite plus point. The story here I was really intrigued by. I read the first chapter in my first chapter reads video that I did for the SPFBO 7 finalists. Again, I'll link that in the top corner. Go and check it out if you haven't seen it already. But this one, you've got dragons, you've got sky pirates or smugglers, you've got airships, and there's a lot of magic in here as well, which kind of isn't really talked about. I don't really see it when I look at the blurb, the synopsis for this book, but it is all throughout the pages when you start reading it. There's some really good characters in here, and some of those were a bit of a surprise because the first few chapters you follow alternating paths. You've got the airship, the smugglers who are on this airship, and then you've got a character who is one of the voiceless, a mute character essentially, and they kind of alternate for the first few chapters, and then you've got some new characters that get brought in after that, and I really appreciated that actually, because a couple of the new characters that were introduced a little bit into the book rather than right at the start were two of the standout characters in the book. I really enjoyed following their story. Overall though, I thought actually all of the characters were quite well done, and I really liked that. There were a few points that I really enjoyed in this book. The magic was very interesting, the overall kind of concept was very interesting, but I did find that it was also a little bit confusing because there wasn't a lot of explanation around the magic and around some of the events that were happening, not just on the pages, but kind of overall events that just happen in this world and ongoing things like the purge that you get. They don't get talked about too much in the book in terms of what they are, why they happen, and things like that. They just kind of are, really, and I felt a little bit like I was expected to go into this book with a little bit of prior knowledge, but I didn't actually have, because there was nowhere for me to get that prior knowledge. Overall though, despite that, I was still able to enjoy the book because of the way it was written, because of the characters, and because of the story within the pages themselves. I did have a good time with it, and I was able to kind of overlook that bit of confusion. That would have taken it up that extra level that I needed to give it 5 stars, but because I didn't have that, and because I was confused at various points as to what was happening and what certain things were, this one came out at 4 stars for me. So there you go. As I said, I had a really good month. I did enjoy the reading that I did overall. Yes, there were a couple of disappointments in there, but I'm still really happy with the reading that I did, and I've got plenty more hopefully coming forth as well. Let me know in the comments down below how your reading went. Did you have any standout books this month that maybe I might want to take a look at? As usual, you find all of my social media and support the channel links in the description box down below, including my book club Discord and my Patreon. I hope to see you again in another video soon, but until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.